Let's pick things up there for tonight's Political Insider. Joining me, Julian Hatten, reporter for The Hill. President Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin held a face-to-face, closed-door meeting after an icy exchange at the UN General Assembly. At the heart of their discussion was the current situation in Syria. Julian, were there any breakthroughs?
No, there weren't, but to be honest, we didn't exactly expect much going into this. These two have had a very tense relationship for years now, and honestly, the fact that they met at all was of note. Going into this meeting, the White House said that all that they really wanted was to get clarity about the Russian leaders' thinking there. They seem to get that over the course of this 90-minute closed-door meeting at the UN, but there doesn't seem to be any major agreements about what to do going forward, no major joint pacts or treaties or truces or anything along those lines.
Now, Obama has said he'll work with the Russians to defeat ISIS in Syria, but only if the country's current president, Bashar Assad, is removed from power. Putin, on the other hand, has sent Russian forces into the country to prop up Assad's regime. Is there any room for compromise? What do you think is going to happen?
It doesn't look like it. This seems to be the biggest point of tension between these two on Syria right now. Russia views that Bashar al-Assad is an ally of sorts of theirs. They admit, maybe he's not the best guy, but he's a leader. He's the legitimate leader, they say, of Syria. And they need to support him as a sort of bulwark against ISIS, which is growing in Syria and Iraq. The White House thinks the opposite. They have been saying for many, many years now that Assad needs to go, and they have attempted to some extent to help encourage his departure, but that has not so far manifested into him actually doing anything. Bashar al-Assad is still there, and this point of tension seems to continue, and this is going to be some friction for the time future.
Yeah, I think you're right. President Obama also called out Russia over its continued aggression in eastern Ukraine, but Putin's speech focused on Syria. Explain what's going on.
Sure. Well, Russia was excommunicated, almost you might say, kind of exiled from the diplomatic community for its support of these separatists in eastern Ukraine over the last couple of years. It was kicked out of the G8, the group of 8 global nations. And so I think that a lot of people think that Moscow sees that it has some role to play in Syria, and by doing so, it can maybe come back into the international fold. It can find a seat at the table again after many, many months out in the cold, and I think that's what they're trying to do here by saying, hey, we're going to play a role here. We have assets and things that we can do to intervene in Syria, to do something about what's happening with the growth of ISIS, and let us play a role, and then we can talk about that other stuff later.
So he's ignoring Ukraine, obviously, on purpose, just saying, that's not for us to discuss right now.
Sure, to some extent, sure. They're saying, the tension is still very, very real. Putin still supports these eastern separatists, and the rest of Western Europe does not. They think that it's a part of Ukraine and should not be breaking away. But that tension ultimately has been going on, and as much as the peace process works its way out in the next couple of weeks here, Russia thinks that it has some role to play with what's going on in Syria and with other issues around the world.
Well, let's switch gears. Cuban President Raul Castro also spoke at the UN General Assembly, calling for the U.S. to end its trade embargo. This was his first speech before the group. How was it received?
Actually, he got a pretty warm reception. This, as you know, was his first speech before the UN General Assembly, and he was relatively strident. He came out there, he said that the U.S. needs to end its embargo against Cuba. He pledged support for Venezuela, for a lot of other countries around the world that have had some tensions with the U.S., and, he adopted a lot of the similar rhetoric that we've seen his brother, Fidel Castro, adopt in the past. And so at the end, he got this big standing ovation from some countries. But, for people who like that message, for people who have not had the best relationship with Washington in recent years, he's been kind of a hero of theirs and has conveyed their message relatively well, and he did so again.
Now, after his speech, Castro also held a closed-door meeting with Obama. How much more work do they have in reestablishing ties between their two countries?
There is still a long way to go. As much as it was a historic moment over the last couple of months to reestablish diplomatic ties between the U.S. and Cuba, we're still a long ways to go before we're, brother and sister, or whatever analogy you want to use. Not only is there the embargo, the Guantanamo Bay naval facility, which is still a point of tension in Cuba. And there are a lot of other both legal, regulatory barriers between the two countries, as well as kind of cultural and economic things that are going on. So we won't be buddy-buddy just yet, but we're certainly a lot farther along than we were a year or two ago.
A lot of balls are being juggled up in the air. Putin, Castro.
It's a busy world.
North Korea's leader,
Sure.
China's leader, Xi
Sure.
Jinping, so much going on. Julian Hatten, reporter for The Hill. Thanks, Julian.
Thank you.